We are here today to talk about Master Plan 3. We waited for over a year to hear it out of Elon's lips. It finally came out at Investor Day a month ago or so. And then he said there would be this white paper, which caused us all to go back into this waiting process because we wanted to know the details. Well, finally, last night it was released. We're going to go through it. Scott, Walter, and I are going to go through this thing. We're not going to take 3 hours or 5 hours like it would probably take to go through it page by page, but we're going to hit some of the highlights that we saw were interesting. If this is interesting to you, please let me know by hitting the like button so I know to do more like this. And then, of course, subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. And got another Patreon member yesterday, so you could be that next one. Please sign up for Patreon. And also follow Scott Walter. Hey, Scott. How are you doing?
Hey, Randy, how you doing?
Well, I'm doing really well. And I looked at this entire thing, and it got me thinking a little bit differently. And one of the things that caused me to think about was there are 8 billion people on the planet, and this is going to cost 10 trillion to do. So all of the CapEx, all of the install, everything is going to cost 10 trillion according to Elon. If you divide that out, it's $1,200 a person. If you do that over 10 years, it's $120 a year. And if you divide that by month, it's $10 a month. So for $10 a month for 10 years, we can have this entire thing done. It reminded me that Tony Seba had said that for the country of India, it would take $1 trillion. There's about 1 billion folks there, so about $1,000 a person. So Tony and Elon have come up with about the same number. I'm sure they approached it very differently, but they both come out with the same number. I thought that was valuable information. And while maybe some people in India can't afford the $10 a month, the reality is nobody has to afford anything because all that money will be done by industry that will want to generate the income from all the installs. Right. So I think this is a marvelous master plan. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. And I would say that the first thing is let's make sure there's like no government involvement. Just kind of, they get out of the way, they let everyone do it, maybe a little bit of incentives, but it is an industry disruption that is sort of happening. And it's going to happen because things wear out and have to be replaced and maintained anyway. So either you could say, well, we have to build a new power station, or we have to decommission a power station, or something like that, or we can build a solar field. So that money is being spent anyway on maintaining the grid, upgrading it, doing whatever. So you look in there were some numbers talking about how long everything lasts. And like usually it was like, hydro, I think was the one that would last the longest, maybe 100 years.
Right.
But everything else was more like 20, 25, 30 years. They wear out, you got to do it. So this money is being spent anyways. It's more or less you're redirecting it where it needs to be.
And in fact,
and
in fact, he said it was only going to cost about 65, 70% of what it would to maintain the existing facilities and build. New, if it was petroleum.
And then once you get it, it ends up running, the maintenance cost after that is going to be a lot less. And also the operational cost is a lot less because now you don't have to worry about fuel or anything else to be keeping everything going. So it absolutely makes sense. It seems like a big price tag at first, but it's really not when you look at how much money we're spending on a lot of other things. How much just the oil infrastructure costs is already quite a bit to maintain that. And then throw on top of the fact that how many billions or close to trillions of dollars we're spending on a military budget to make sure those fields are secure.
Right.
I mean, we're spending a lot of money on that really could be redirected somewhere else quite easily. And
then on top of that, 5 or 6 or 7 years from now, there'll be a tremendous amount of recycling of this material.
Yes.
So you won't have to go back and mine it again. It'll be recycled over and over again.
Right.
So we will over say by the end of the 10-year period, when 100% of it is electric instead of petroleum based, then mining will start to become less and less of an issue, period.
More of a maintenance issue at that point of just sort of that some of the stuff that gets lost, or the fact that there's still a little bit of growth that's going on that you'd be catching up for that, just the maintenance. But almost everything is going to become a circular economy, which is really quite nice.
And then you do,
No
but
more
you
digging
need the
pits.
processing, but you need the processing. And so
Mhm.
Elon has made that point in this master plan as well, is that there still will need to be a lot of investment or continuing investment and maintenance of the
Mhm.
processing side of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now, there's one point I got to make, Randy, is that, you know, when I looked at the master plan, really trying to understand the background of it, I realized I needed some like additional material to understand what's going on. So, in anticipation of that, I ordered something from Amazon. I think it came in here. I just got this here right now, and I think it should help with the background of what's going on, of sort of the rationale and the thinking.
Okay.
So it's right in here.
Oh, you just got your copy.
Just got my copy. Yeah,
Well,
just got it.
That's good. Well, everybody should get a copy. If you haven't
It's an
got your-
unboxing video. There you go. And I actually had box cutters. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to share screen.
There it is. Yeah.
Okay. Go. Yeah, you can leave that up as long as you. Okay.
We'll
all
leave
right.
it up. Okay. I got to find a bookshelf back here somewhere to put it on. That's all.
There you go. All right, I'm going to share screen here. We're going to take a look at my first graphic, and I don't think anybody else stops on this graphic. Now, part of the reason probably that I stop on this graphic is because it looks to me like California desert.
Right.
I'm pretty sure it is. I'm not sure which facility it is. But what I loved about this graphic was it emphasizes the solar and the batteries, which are the two main components. In fact, I think you could have been, no, it wasn't. It was another author in the Elon Musk mission. It was Brian Wang, who said, eventually it's all going to be solar. It's not going to be wind. He said, over time, they'll realize, first of all, when we get down to maybe we'll see, as we dig into the numbers, wind is a lot more expensive to install, a lot more expensive to maintain. And the hourly or the dollars or cents per kilowatt hour, a kilowatt produced are more expensive than solar. So he says over time, it'll probably all go to solar. But what I love about the shot is what land is this taking up? It's not taking up any land that is going to have some other use case. This is not where we're going to put a lot of homes or have other reasons. So no farms.
Doesn't right. Doesn't look arable at all. So
right. And there's tons of land like this all over the world. China famously has, and Russia both have huge amounts of this kind of land, even worse, that is plenty useful for these purposes. So I thought that was a really good place to start. So let's go down. Executive summary. So what were your thoughts? Did you have any thoughts when you were looking at this, other than the 10 trillion, which we already kind of broke that up?
Well, the storage is pretty big. And then you're looking at it compared to the renewables. So if you're getting 8 hours of renewable power generation a day, that gives you the 240 terawatts hours of storage. So I guess that's kind of what it's looking at. And, 10% sounds like a lot. It's about 10% of world GDP, but we're already spending that much yearly anyways, just for energy and anything kind of related to the energy that's there. It doesn't take up a whole lot of land, which is nice. And then even the land that takes up, it's not like it's destroying the land or doing anything about it, that it can never be restored. In many cases, it can be done over existing areas. Could be, parking lots, buildings, stuff like that will be a certain percentage. And then in other areas, it could be used along with agriculture to allow you to grow crops that normally can't grow. It will also prevent a lot of evapotranspiration that happens in these areas. We're talking about like over river canals and stuff like that, that you would be able to reduce the amount of evaporations going on. So there's already projects like that you will get a side benefit to a lot of this, as well as I think there'd almost be like a cooling effect. It's possible, depending on where it is, it might have a slight impact on the local weather system. Like the lack of thunderstorm production or something like that, because you may not be having, you're capturing a lot of incoming solar energy, and rather than it heating the atmosphere around there, it could have some sort of impacts there. But the other thing that was always key in the presentations, I talked about, you only need half the energy.
Right.
And I think that's where everyone has been sort of stymied, is that they say, oh, you need, twice that amount. And if you, yeah, well, that's because half the energy is used to dig up the energy in the first place.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah, it's kind of a waste. It's like it's the problem with the rocket, is that a lot of the fuel in a rocket is just used to lift the fuel you need later on. It has nothing to do with lifting the payload. And that's the same problem with a lot of energy production. A lot of it just goes into, mining, refining, transportation, everything else. And when suddenly you come up with a different form of bringing in energy, suddenly there's less waste, which is shown in that graphic right there.
Right. And then that's getting it to wherever it's going to go, but then
right. And then
get it into the host, if you will.
Right.
Then you end up having substantially in this particular case, the vehicles, you have substantially less energy used to move the car a mile.
And moving, right. And like what they like to say is from well to wheel, it's way more efficient. So yes, the cost of extraction, harvesting, that is reduced quite a bit by going with solar and wind. But then at the same time, when you actually take that energy that you have and start using it in an application, is far more efficient than the other, which is just producing nothing but waste heat. And it turns out not just in transportation, also in heating, when we start getting to the heat pumps.
Yeah, now that was way down in the report, so I'm not going to skip all the way down.
Right. So right now we already have an efficiency ratio of nearly 5.
Right.
Which is incredible.
Right.
Just for transportation. Yes.
And that's what, when people argue, electric cars are still using electricity that's made by coal or made by oil. But the point is that it's only using 20 to 25% of what an ICE car would use in that same circumstance. So if they're both getting from the same resource, even if it's still dirty, the usage is 20 to 25%.
Right. And one of the things is the canard out there has always been about, well, you're running on coal. If you actually accept that for a second, it's like, yep, 100% of the energy going into my Tesla is coming from coal. And you know what? It's still cleaner than an ICE vehicle. It's still actually the CO2 emissions from that is less.
Yeah, right.
So even in the worst case, the straw man argument they're going to put up there is like, no, it's not true. And less and less of that as we go on and on down the food chain as far as the electricity usage. Yep.
All right. So then they use an exact attempt to give a comparison between a Toyota Corolla, which has been, I guess, the best-selling car in history up till now, and a Model 3, which are, I guess, similar size. And it shows that the wheel portion of it is the blue portion, from the well portion is the gray portion, and showing just the comparison in terms of the usage, which is, I think, what you were just trying to point out.
It's remarkable. So even with like the transmission losses and everything else from the power station to your battery, and then the energy loss from going there to your wheel, I think it's like around 80% of that energy is actually used in electromotive force to make the car go forward. It's not that way with the gasoline engine. The gasoline engine might be like 30% or something like that. So 70% of that is just waste heat that's coming out.
Right.
It's really not being used for anything else. And then, that's just in your engine. And then you start going backstream and realizing that there are all these other engines that were sort of needed to be able to transport and move the oil from one location to another. So that's why it's inefficient. Is that the conversion from chemical energy to mechanical energy is always less. It's rarely does it even get close to 50%. It's very, very hard to get to that level.
Yeah. And of course, when you and I were younger, everybody was worried that we were going to run out of coal, run out of oil, run out of natural gas. I was never quite sure that was true, but whether it was or wasn't, this completely eliminates that issue as well as we switch to electricity and wind, because you're never going to run out of those two. Well, never for a long time. So then here we go. Here's the heat pump thing. I was kind of blown away that most of the videos I've watched so far of other YouTubers who I love them all, but not many of them have spent any time on this heat pumps thing. And yet the master plan 3 spent pages and pages and pages on it. And again,
Yes.
I don't want to assume just because they spent all this time on heat pumps that means Tesla's going to start producing heat pumps tomorrow, but I've been dying.
Well, they already are. That's the whole idea behind the Octovalve.
Of course.
And they do have a heat pump in there. And if you really want to understand how a heat pump works, I recommend a YouTube channel called Technology Connections with Alex. And he just does a great job on all kinds of technology. I mean, like how old electronics work, which is how I first came across his channel. And it's amazing some of the deep dives he does that, but he does a couple of great deep dives on how heat pumps work and the improvements that have happened, because earlier heat pumps had some issues that they were not always perfect in really cold climates and everything else, but there's been improvements, and you begin to understand why they make so much sense for a heat source. Because I can remember taking my thermodynamics class in college where they first talked about this. It was like the first time I saw something where the efficiency was greater than 100%. I was like, oh, wait a minute, that's a perpetual motion machine or something like that. It's like, it's really amazing. You're talking about something where the amount of energy coming out is a multiple of the energy going in. And that's what a heat pump does. And if you think a heat pump is something exotic and weird, you don't have to go any further than your refrigerator or your air conditioner, because those are heat pumps.
They're kind of a reverse of the heat pump that Elon.
Yes. Right. Now we all know that from thermodynamics and entropy says that heat always flows from higher temperatures to lower temperatures.
Yep.
And that when you have two systems, one that's warmer and one that's hotter, and when they're in contact, eventually they come to an equilibrium where the temperature of one will come down, the other will come up, and that'll be it. They'll be in that stasis. And of course, what we like to do on really hot days is we like to say, well, it's really hot outside and it's going to get warmer in the house. We want to do something to take the heat that's in the house and make it go backwards, literally make it go uphill. And that's what a heat pump does, is it's able to pump it back up there, but it does it in a really ingenious way, is that it takes the pretty much it soaks up some of the heat energy in your house and literally makes it hotter and brings it outside. So now that thing's hotter, the heat can then exchange from that hot air up there to there, and you reduce it. And then when you bring it back into the house, when it goes through a phase change, because it's lost that, suddenly it's very, very cold. So the whole idea is you get this working fluid that's able to change states. And when you get into those state changes and you go from high pressure to low pressure, you can make something when you bring it back that now is at much lower temperature than it was before. So it's not like they're necessarily defeating the laws of thermodynamics. It's like, no, we are actually doing we have heat exchangers on both sides. So you have a hot side and you've got a cold side that's able to work. And in the end, the result is you're taking energy and you're pulling out and you're putting it in another place. The other thing that's amazing is that anyone that has seen the air conditioning units that you have outside your house, it'll just be on a concrete platform of some sort. It's a big heat exchanger with a big fan in there to try to blow as much air through there to get that exchange as rapidly as possible. And there's a little condenser unit out there, and then there will be something else on the inside of the house. That is your air conditioner. And with a very simple thing, just like a valve that kind of turns the flow that goes the other way around, that air conditioning unit can turn into a heat pump in the wintertime. So what's happening is in the summertime, you're air conditioning your house. You're cooling your house down. And if you go over to the AC unit, you can feel all the hot air blowing out of that thing. That's the hot air you're extracting from the house. You turn that thing around, and it doesn't mean like you unplug it and move it around there. Literally, you just turn the flows around the other way. And now you are air conditioning the outdoors in the wintertime. Okay. So you actually try to make it colder outside technically. And you're doing it by extracting what little bit of heat is actually in. I mean, even though it seems cold out there, there is heat content in air until you bring it down to absolute zero. So there's always a certain amount of heat energy you can extract, and all they're trying to do is pull that in. And so long as you've got a good source, it's good. Now, a heat pump works better if the temperature differentials between the two is small. When it starts to become big, it gets to be pretty bad. So for heating purposes, for a lot of heat pumps, when the temperatures start getting on the freezing mark, or below, they start losing their efficiency. They're not so good. And that's why it's a little bit of a problem up north. But they have found workarounds to that. One of the problems they had is that the unit you had outdoors tends to attract moisture and then freeze. You know? So you need some way to unfreeze it, and they come up with a cycle to go ahead and do that. And you can also use these heating strips to supplemental resistance heating in those extreme cases. But in extremely cold areas, the best way for your heat source that you're tapping into, rather than tapping into cold air, tap into the groundwater.
Oh yeah.
Or tap into the ground. So you go down there and you have usually a constant source of heat, which usually is like 59 degrees or something like that. That's like almost perfect for a heat pump. You do that, you'll get a COP of 5 or more easily for all your heating needs. So, so when you get down into the 40s and 30s, it starts to degrade a little bit.
So kind of like the caves are always about the same temperature year round. So you're basically,
well, yes,
trying to
part of that, because and later on in there, they talk about this idea of heat sinks, or like a heat battery of things that absorb it. So anything that's very solid mass, usually referred to as has a really good thermal mass, just like, it, from the inertia standpoint, it's hard to push. It's also hard to change the temperature of rock or something like that, which is why cathedrals are never freezing cold in the wintertime. They may feel a little bit dank, but they're definitely warmer than the outside. And in the summertime, they're never too hot. They have a natural form of air conditioning. Same thing is like why cheeses go down into caves like you're talking about, because you have a nice constant temperature there, because you're surrounded by this big thermal mass. And so there are clever things you can do with insulation and everything else, finding materials with these state change properties, because we know the amount of energy it takes to go from like 0 degrees up to 100. And centigrade with water. And then to actually take it and go to boiling, you have to put a lot more energy in there, the phase transition. The same thing when you go from water to ice, there is a lot of heat either needed to melt the ice, that last bit, or in the opposite direction. So that's this latent heat of transformation that's happening within there. And that has got great content. So if you find a material that has a phase change, let's say at 72 degrees, that would be like perfect insulation for the walls in your house, because it'll just absorb all this heat. And then if it starts to get too cold, it'll start to put it out there and try to maintain the temperature at 72. And if it gets a little bit too high, it'll do the same thing. And so they're engineering materials to be able to do that as well, to act as these heat batteries as well. So when you collect the heat during the daytime, you will be able to grab it. But I kind of digress here.
Well, no, that's good. I think that's good, because this is a very, very large percentage.
Oh yeah.
After transportation, it's the largest amount of energy that we're using. I think lighting might be up there as well, but lighting.
Light turns out doesn't. Yeah, I mean, heat is what we really use a lot of energy in. Turns out you don't need that much electricity to turn on your lights compared to everything else. I mean, think about it. A flashlight lasts really, really long, but you take that same battery and you try to run a motor, it goes down really quick. So, or for heating or anything else. So, it turns out we're pretty good at converting electricity into light nowadays. The efficiency there is much, much better. Now, when it comes to the heat pumps, and, in theory, what you could do with your refrigerator, like I say, is a heat pump. If you wanted to, if you turned your refrigerator around and took the back end of the refrigerator, because if you go down the bottom of the refrigerator, you'll notice it gets kind of warm. There's warm air coming out there. If you stuck that into your window and had that like facing out and open your fridge, you could use it as an air conditioner for your house. Then in the wintertime, you could turn around the other way and then have the part that's heating out. And that's kind of the principle. It's not the most efficient, but the idea of the Octovalve and the integration is an idea that I kind of accidentally came across several years ago visiting Florida. And when I saw the Octovalve, that's why I was really excited about what Tesla was doing. And it was very simple. We had rented a house in the Orlando area over Thanksgiving. And the reason why you rent a house is that, you want the pool that goes with it and everything else. And we came down, and Thanksgiving, it's just it's cool enough in Florida that the pool water is not right where you want it to be. So you got to you've got to heat the pool water. But at the same time, it gets a bit too warm in the house to not have the AC running. So the house we were running had two identical units on opposite sides of the house, absolutely identical units. One of them was for AC and the other one was for heating the pool. So a heat pump was being used to heat the pool. When I walked by one of them, it was freezing cold. So it was like taking this air and then trying to make the outside air much, much colder. Then I walked around the other side of the house where the other heat pump was sitting there and it was just blasting out heat like crazy. As I say, all I did was like to just kind of turn something around. And I'm just thinking, wait a minute, just combine these things. Okay. Let's pull the heat out of the house. That thing is blasting out and let's blast it straight into the pool and warm it up that way. That is the whole idea of the Octovalve. It's to realize you've got all these things going on inside your house. It could be one. Ideally, you're going to have one heat pump in your house, which is going to run everything.
Right.
Your hot water heater, for one thing.
Yes.
So the hot water heater is a great sink right there.
Right.
And you can also kind of use it when you maybe have excess energy. It's like, oh, we're getting all this energy. Just heat up the water,
Right.
And we don't care if we make it, super, super hot. A lot of times you only put it at 130 because you don't want to scald yourself or something like that. The reality is there's nothing wrong with putting up to 180 or something more than that. Then you just make sure you have a good unit for mixing the water so no one gets scalded. Right. And those, you can set those things up. They have something that's equivalent of like a circuit breaker that you can put on any sort of faucet that if it comes out too hot, it stops. So you could have that. So now you don't need to have a hot water heater in the whole structure. You just need to have something that stores hot water. Your refrigerator could just become a cabinet now, where you would have an accessory that you plug into that goes downstairs into your basement or where the central unit is that is doing the heating and cooling for the whole house.
Right.
All this stuff would be balanced. And then you start integrating it with solar panels you have on there to have that driving it. And in some cases, to make the solar panels efficient, you'd like to cool the solar panels, so you would just have something that's equivalent to the Octovalve, just shunting the electricity, the heating and cooling where it's needed at that point. Because there are some parts of your house that need heating while other parts of the house need cooling simultaneously. And you bring those two things together and you get extreme energy efficiencies. So,
and then if you plug, and then if you put a nice pole down into the earth about 40 feet.
Yeah.
Now
That's even more. Or again, if you've got a swimming pool. So if you're in a climate where you have a swimming pool, you could be using something like that, which would be either a heat sink or a heat source, depending upon what you're needing. But you're right. If you get something down there, and actually in Sweden, they had the problems with the houses are very close and they were using the geothermal where they were going down into the ground and using the water down there for their heat pumps. And the problem is so many people had it that they literally froze the ground too much in the wintertime. And in the summertime, they'd actually have to run the heat pumps the other way and then drive heat back down there to kind of warm it back up to use it as like the heat battery to make sure they had enough for the next season. So there are some communal things like that. You have to think about how deep you have to go down. And the geothermal, it's expensive to put those pipes in there. I mean, it's a great idea, but someone's going to come up with a better way of being able to do it without it being so costly. It's extremely costly.
And it's only where it's needed. In a lot of places, a lot of places they just wouldn't.
You don't need it. You don't need it everywhere, but it's nice to have in the places where the air is really cold. In mid latitudes, say from Tennessee south, you're fine with a heat pump. You almost don't need. There might be a few. Some people probably argue in a few mountain villages around there where it gets pretty nippy at night. That you can get by with a heat pump. Florida for sure. Even when it occasionally gets a little bit cold, it'll be able to do it. The problem in Florida is we don't insulate our buildings well enough for our houses. So when it gets cold outside, man, it comes right into the house really quick. Whereas up north, you tend to last a little bit longer before it starts to get chilly.
So then Elon goes into the industrial side and starts talking about the potential for the use of the heat pump in industry. And there's a real, another massive application in terms of people that are running smelters or running any kind of high energy, things of that nature. I would guess that probably in my plastics manufacturing business, we were using a tremendous amount of heat to make those bottles. So wherever there's this kind of thing, you can also go and get a great application in an industrial setting.
Yes. And again, they're talking about, the fluids that can be heated, the molten salts that are there. You don't think of salt as being molten, but that's the whole idea of a phase change. So when you go between those two, you can store a lot of energy in there and release it really quickly
Right.
when you get that phase change. So they're very good at storing the heat. And the other thing is, I think up there was the duck curve they're showing with electricity energy generation. One of the problems you have is the demand. And so depending upon the season, you get these two kinds of demands. In the wintertime, you have an early morning demand and an evening demand. In the middle, you don't have a whole lot. In the summer, it tends to go up during the day and then down. The problem is your energy generation from solar or wind doesn't match that usage exactly the way it is. So sometimes you come short of that, or you have way in excess. And when you have that excess, you're trying to figure out what to do with it. And they talk about the curtailment of the renewables, where they're producing all this electricity, but they can't use it. It goes to waste. Well, that's when you have some places in industry that can absorb it at any time, just to say, well, I don't need the heat right now, but I know I'm going to need it tomorrow. So I'm just going to charge up those heat batteries to make sure I have enough there. So there will always be a place that you can dump it. And there's also a company in Finland that's working on some clever ways of being able to, it's called, I think Polar Nights. And they were featured on the Now You Know Me channel about a year or so ago, looking at that, of literally taking, sand and figuring out how to heat that up and using it within district heating that they have in a lot of the cities and villages in Finland. It just all makes sense because they were getting so much electricity during the long Finnish summers,
Right.
that they didn't know what to do with, that they could use that to store what they would need to be able to make it through the winter. So
Well,
there are ways of doing it, and it's all about storage.
We did kind of switch subjects then to this business of curtailment and storage.
Mhm.
Let's see, I'm trying to see if I could get down to that. Maybe I'll be able to find it, maybe I won't.
Yeah,
here
I'm
we
not
go.
trying to
Here's
think
the
if that
thing.
was sort of, yeah, there we go. So that's the one that is showing a little bit where you end up having excess energy generation, and what are you going to do with it?
Right. And so Tony Seba has talked about this as well. He talks about it as being
Mhm.
superpower.
Yep. At that point, what are you going to do with it?
What are
You
you
just
gonna
sit
do?
around, what's going to happen, and then just schedule something around that time of day.
So, and again, certain industries could move closer to these specific generating places. Certain industries where if the energy was 100% free or close to free,
Mhm.
they could make something that they couldn't otherwise make. It would be a useful product if the energy was free. Or if
Yes.
the energy was cheaper, it would make sense to put the plant
Right.
there.
Right.
So
Right.
so there could be new uses, completely new ideas that would come out of all this. Right. So, but then they talk about the storage and the different kinds of storage. It was interesting to look at the storage possibilities of you can store it in hydrogen. You could store it as pumped hydro.
Mhm.
You could do it as mechanical. You can store it in sand, as you were pointing out, and of course, batteries. So
Right. So
you'd
the
like
idea
to
of the
use as much
thermal.
battery as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. So what you do with the thermal is that you store enough of it that then you could heat up steam that you could then spin a turbine to produce electricity. But then there's still a lot of loss there. And what they're saying is that no, the thermal storage should really be for industrial thermal loads only. Let's look at where the loads are, where the heat is needed. Let's just go ahead and store it there already as a heat, and not do this transformation back and forth, because then you're wasting way too much doing
Right.
it that way. The pumped hydro makes it a little bit more sense for being able to generate electricity. And, it's been around, that technology, for a long time. The problem is finding the right locations for them. It's not that easy. Not everywhere can you find a reservoir that's up on a mountaintop or something like that to give you the hydraulic head that you would need to run your turbines.
Right. And then you look at the cost. The cost for installation is less for the mechanical, but then the cost, the output was much higher than the batteries. By the way, the batteries is this line here, the eChem, the lithium ion battery.
Yep.
So you're only looking at 80 cents a kilowatt hour to store it. And that seems like a really, really good deal compared to $15 a kilowatt hour.
Yes, exactly. And then, the funny thing about a lot of these gases, and there's even been the idea of like liquefied air or compressed air and everything else as a storage, because, think about it, the pressure of the air in your bicycle pump can do useful work if you wanted it to. So if you just compressed a lot of air, pump something up, but what
Right,
do you put that
right.
in? You have to make a big tank. It's like, no, we're not making a big tank. We're just finding some old salt mines or something like that. These old caverns that are absolutely huge, and they just start filling it up, which to me was like, really? And that's what they're talking about with hydrogen. To me, that's kind of surprising that you could fit that in there without the hydrogen escaping. But okay, if that's a way of doing it, potentially that's one way of storing hydrogen without having to actually build the tank farms to be able to store it all.
Right,
And
right.
I imagine it's probably in a, I'm not sure how pressurized it is compared to what you would actually be putting it into a tank.
Yeah, so overall, one of the things I took away from this, again, I've been hoping that they were going to use their technology to be able to make, home-sized HVAC units that would heat your
Mhm.
water and heat your dryer and everything else, all the things he talks about. Hopefully that's still coming, and hopefully it's coming soon. But now I gather you have to listen to Elon and look at sometimes for what he's emphasizing. I have to think that he's also thinking about doing industrial size heat pumps as well.
Yes.
Going into that whole system with the Octovalve approach. Again, when you're in that situation, a lot of factories, a lot of warehouses can't afford to air condition or heat those facilities. And so people end up freezing or dying of the heat. I know, I've been in them. But with heat pump, you might be able to at least reduce the offensiveness of the air in some of those places.
Right, right. And in many cases, we're just taking the heat that we're expelling and just throwing it back into the atmosphere when there may be some way of taking that and storing it for later use.
Exactly.
So there's plenty of ways of being able to be more clever on how we move electricity around and reuse it.
All right, then we got the generation approaches. I mentioned earlier that Brian Wong had said, listen, it's all going to be solar at some point. But right now he is breaking it down into solar, onshore, offshore, wind, hydro, and nuclear. There are new nuclear facilities finally being built around the world. I think the first US installation is coming this year. In 20 years. I think it's been 20 or 30 years, maybe.
It's probably been a while. Yep.
Installation in the United States. So the likelihood is, I think, that it's, again, probably going to all go solar, except for what we already have in hydro. They're not going to close the dams, I don't think. Some dams, like Hoover Dam, was really set up to be a flood control, for flood control, not for hydro. So I think the Southern California folks would appreciate it if Hoover Dam stays there, because the floods we're getting this year, nothing compared to what we would get if that dam.
The benefit was the hydro after that, but it was really flood control and also a reservoir. I mean, was a pretty big reservoir for a while there.
San Gabriel Valley is basically a floodplain. So those of you who have ever lived or driven through the San Gabriel Valley, gone down to Disneyland, this entire area is a floodplain between mountains. So yeah, we need the Hoover Dam. Anyway, off subject. So this is the kind of the layout. Again, a lot of solar, a lot of onshore and offshore wind initially, because right now the onshore and especially offshore wind can go up pretty quickly, and it produces a lot, and it's not something that's interfering with anything else. So but
it's way more costly than I thought. I mean, when I saw that table yesterday, I was kind of shocked to see how cheap solar was compared to everything else.
Yeah.
And that, Brian is right that, wind is just not going to be competitive right now. Wind is filling in some of the gaps for solar. But eventually when you have adequate storage, it's going to be very, very little wind.
And solar again down rapidly.
Yeah. And, and the cycle, so 30 years, it's a lot easier to recycle the solar panels probably than it will be for wind turbines, which they are working on a good means of recycling. So it's right now they were getting a lot of criticism because they're just going into landfills. It's like, no, they're not. They know how to recycle that. It's going to happen. The interesting number there is for nuclear. The lifetime is less than 80 years. I'm like, well, let's see. Do we have any that are hitting 80 years? I mean, there's some that have been running way past their expiration dates.
Right, right.
I think there's some that are clearly, 50 or more years, and they're really not supposed to be, but
Yeah,
they keep on getting relicensed. And I'm not even sure that the most modern ones coming up would, have like an 80 or 100 years. So they're being very generous there, probably.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe you can say 50, but I just remember it was always 30 years. And I worked on a lot of projects with these companies that were looking at decommissioning and how the robotics would go in to help them. And part of it was how we were going to put the robots in there to do the decommissioning. In other words, like, oh, how can we put the robots in there to recommission it, to kind of keep it going, to get another 20 years out of it.
Right.
And it was a really interesting project because the robots are supposed to go in there and start cutting things up into small pieces so they could get it out for disposal.
Yeah.
And then in the end, they literally had to cut the robots up too, because
Yeah,
the robots were radiated as well. So it just came this constant problems. Like, well, how are you going to take care of that? Yeah, because they had so many stations that were getting close to that 30 year, and then they pushed them to 40, 45 or whatever. But
Sure. Well, and they should be. Oh, and then geothermal, they're not looking at any new build there either. Doesn't seem to be that efficient either. So, all right. So then the model results. Installed. So we look at how fast this stuff is going up. I did a kind of a deep dive into this last year, and it was like, why isn't solar being deployed even faster than it is? Why isn't offshore wind in particular being deployed even faster than it is? And it turns out there was a singular reason: not enough battery storage.
Okay, I think there's two reasons. I think offshore, there has been a lot of regulatory issues and people not wanting it offshore. So I think only recently was some of those leases in the New England and the Carolinas. Was it the off coast of the Carolinas or?
Well, you're talking U.S. I was talking
in the U.S.
worldwide. So
worldwide, yeah, it's usually been a little bit easier. But you're right about the batteries, and there was a graph that was sort of tweeted about, I think, a week or two ago, that was showing the deployment of solar in Texas versus California.
Yeah.
And if you look at the two, you'll get kind of a misimpression of what's going on there, because the California curve is starting to look like the S curve, where it's starting to level out. So it's still going up, but you can see it's not going up like this. Whereas the Texas curve, when you put it on there, because they started a little bit later, it's going up like this, and they're at the beginning of their S curve, and pretty soon that curve is going to cross, and there's going to be more in Texas. And the reason in California is that they have actually too much solar right now. So the renewable penetration has sort of reached that level where you're having that curtailment all the time.
Well, transmission lines.
Transmission is part of it, but a lot of it is just actually storage, is that they cannot store it. So and it's turning out that the hourly rates that you get, because you have this wholesale market and it's hourly. So when they're getting the maximum production, the rates go way down on the wholesale market, right, and it's almost not worth it. So they're being paid practically less than what it really costs them to produce it. And then when it goes up in the evening, where the sun's down, they could be getting more. They don't have anything to deliver, because that's the thing about electricity, is it's the only commodity that's produced at the moment that it's consumed.
Right.
It has zero shelf life. So that's its big problem, is you can't warehouse all this stuff and sell. And that's why storage is so important. So when you have that, now you can start taking advantage of those markets and start saying it makes sense. So you're not going to be seeing a whole lot of new solar fields coming into California until they start having more storage or battery storage along with it. And that's what gets Amy and Bradford and Dan kind of excited, that are looking at what's going on in Lathrop and trying to figure out, all right, how much storage do we have here? And they see it as a big part of the energy picture for Tesla, because it is.
Yes.
And as much as they're producing, it's still nowhere near enough, because they're having customers say, you're gonna have to already wait till 2025.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we know how bad it is waiting for Cybertruck, It's like, so you're waiting for your mega packs, and they cannot produce them fast enough, and they are going to be needed for these solar deployments to go up. So once the battery storage goes in there, you're going to start to see a second S curve starting to happen in California. And there may be the death knell for a lot of wind, because wind is the renewable that then fills in those gaps, right, when solar's not there. But if the battery is able to do it, then suddenly it's harder and harder to justify a wind project. And I love wind. I mean, I don't see it go away. That was like part of my master's thesis, was working
Oh,
on a
no.
wind turbine design. So it's like, there's a soft spot in my heart for a wind turbine.
So you said in the very beginning, you said you'd like to see government stay out of these things. And I think that the California, Texas example can give us a clear example of that. So California put in all this solar and some of the early battery installations purely politically. It was purely emotionally driven because we needed to solve global warming. And so they forced Southern California Edison and the one in the north, I forget the name. Anyway, they forced these companies to have a certain percentage of solar or renewable energy producing out there. In Texas, it was looked at as a business. In Texas, they said, there's a business here. So they created their solar farms and their battery backup and whatever that they're doing in Texas based on a business proposition. And they're getting, reaping the benefit out of that. I noticed in Oklahoma driving through, man, they got a lot of wind farms in Oklahoma. There's so many wind farms.
Indian money talks. I mean, you think of Texas as being a big oil state, and that there may be some political leanings to favor that industry.
Yeah.
But if there's money to be made, nobody cares. And this is the thing people have to understand. The most powerful force on the planet is our markets.
Right.
And all you want to do is that you want to help guide the markets to take that energy and that force and that potential and lean it in the right direction. So there will be a certain amount of government regulation needed to make sure the playing field is okay and some people aren't doing shenanigans, and a certain amount of incentives to kind of push it in that direction. But that's about all they need to do, is just give the incentives to nudge the market in that way, and you'll get the forces. And that's what Elon noticed very, very early on, is come up with a car that's compelling that everyone wants to drive.
Right.
And the fact that it's EV doesn't matter anymore. They don't care. It's like, it's the coolest, best thing. And you start doing all these things and people will look at it for the market potential. But if you give them something that absolutely nobody wants, you will never get that transition. That's right. So that's why I say it's they just got to kind of get out of the way, stop stepping on everyone's feet, let them through, work on it, and just make sure that nothing dastardly is going on. That's the role of government for the most part, is to be, a good ombudsman and referee sometimes when they need to be. Elon has said it. I mean, he hates regulation sometimes, but the other time he'll turn right around and say, we need regulation. It's the best thing. Right. So if it's done right, it could be fine. Get the right incentives, and then we should be, the transition will happen and this master plan will be executed.
So now, of course, with Tesla, everybody, even the investors and even the people that are the craziest about Tesla and recognize that energy storage and robots and all these other things that are coming might be larger than this division. Although if you put the two together, if you put trucks in if you put all the semi trucks together with all the cars, it might still be the second largest division after robots. Anyway, but having said that, the master plan spells out how many vehicles will be needed for the global fleet to replace the existing global fleet, as well as expectations of how many per year would be needed in order to start going 100%. So 42 million compacts per year would be needed. So the new car, the Gen 3 car, would be 42 million a year would be needed in order to get there. We're assuming, of course, that Tesla will get 25% of each of these categories. So that's my assumption. I don't think they're shooting for more than 25% of any of these categories. So ultimately, that would suggest that Elon is thinking they might do 10 million of these compact vehicles. Maybe it'll be less in this particular case because China and South Korea might end up owning a lot of that business. But then you get to the mid-size, the Model 3s and Ys, 24 million of that. So 25% of that would be 6 million. So that seems pretty much on case for a couple of million Ys and 4 million, a couple of million 3s and 4 million Ys. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. And then, maybe by 2030, you're going to have a couple of derivatives of those in there as well.
Right.
They're not going to have a lineup of 50 different vehicles, but they're also not going to have a lineup of just only 6.
Right.
They will have a couple in there.
Well, in the compact division in particular, I can imagine,
Yeah.
multiple versions of whatever that's going to be. And half of all these, half of the compacts and half the mid-sized will probably be autonomous robotaxis.
Right.
Owned as the fleet by Tesla themselves. All right. Commercial passenger vans to be determined. Everybody's taking this to mean that Tesla is going to be in the commercial passenger van business. Well, they did state it.
Yes, I think.
Did state that
Yes. So
commercial-
compact. So, yeah. So to be determined is, yeah. So probably. So there is nothing. There's no equivalent there. So it's not necessarily saying that they're going to, but they might.
He did hint at Investor Day that there would be or was that Investor Day or was that AI Day too?
Is there a slide right after this? Or is it the slide before it? There's an image.
Yes, there is that famous.
There we go. There's the image. All right.
Famous image, right?
Where you're looking at those different classifications in the fleet that they have there. And the semi truck is sort of in one of those, and then along with the van.
Right.
And so that's the one that's 300 million is whatever it's assuming is the van. It certainly looks like a van.
Van and the cyber together. Yeah.
Right. And the 700 million is kind of the compact.
Right.
Even though it doesn't look very compact in that image, but it's the scaling is way off. I mean, it looks bigger than the S and the X and everything else,
Right.
but it's definitely going to be smaller. But it does have an interesting, if that is the shape, it's a rather interesting shape for a compact.
Right.
But
Right.
we're trying to read between the lines here. We know absolutely nothing. I mean, if you go back up there, the inference that most people are thinking is that the Gen 3 platform is going to be a 53 kilowatt hour battery pack.
Right.
And that's not necessarily the case, because the Tesla equivalent is just for reference. And the pack size that's in there is not what you see in the 3 and the Y. It's not 75.
Right.
They're a little bit bigger. And the same thing with a compact is that I think the global fleet that's out there, you probably have some packs that might be as low as 40 and some that might be more like 60 or even higher for a compact. So that's probably just some sort of average or guess, but could be a big hint. You never know. Maybe that was actually put in there for a reason.
I
know I've seen a lot of people saying that's what it's going to be. And it's like, you can't quite make that inference. Not
only that, there's a lot of nuance to some of this stuff. So it's right now, he's saying 50 or this particular analysis is suggesting a 53 pack size for the entire category of compact cars.
Probably the average. They're seeing that as that's what the average would be for that category. Probably.
Or all car makers, all sizes, all
over the whole fleet,
all versions.
Which is probably where that 75 comes from for the midsize, because that is not the average for Tesla, but it may be more of an average for the industry, or what they actually see is probably what it should be to meet the needs of that particular class.
And may not be taking into consideration the fact that by 2030, you might be able to get away with a 30 pack size.
Right. Because of the efficiencies that you would have. Yes. If the mass of those batteries goes way down, then suddenly the efficiency will go way up. Absolutely.
Exactly. All right. Commercial passenger vans. We talked about that. We've been hinted at that's coming. Large sedans, SUVs, and trucks. We know that that's obviously a category that they're in and expecting to expand a lot. The next one was interesting, bus. So there's a few bus makers out there that are fairly successful at this point, in particular in China, but also in the United States. I'm forgetting the name of the company. I followed them for a while and I stopped. But there's a few bus companies out there making electric buses successfully. But this, again, the TBD there, people are taking that as that Tesla will get into the bus business. I'm not sure of that, but maybe they will. It was
it's either to be determined or to be decided. I mean, they're definitely not committing one way or the other. But then again, if you look at the vehicle sales, that's surprisingly small. That's the smallest category of them all.
Right.
Though I guess the average selling price for those is going to be a little bit higher than the others.
Yes.
They're not going to be $30,000 or anything like that.
Right.
So yeah, it's kind of a niche market, whether you want to go into making buses or not.
Right. And then we have the semi lights and the semi heavies, which he's divided it. So this is another area where Brian Wong has been really, really interested and focused on. He thinks there's a 4 million unit market. Tesla's saying a 3 million. We'll take either one of those. If Tesla is going to get 25% of 3 million, then that would be 800,000 compared to the million that I've been talking about. But again, we'll take either one of those. And but obviously a huge market that most people even in the community, even in the Tesla community, are ignoring, really totally ignoring in terms of the potential for meeting the mission as well as for sales and profits.
Yes.
So let's see, was there anything else in here that we needed to talk about? World results. This is where
I think there's a few other things that we need to make sure people sort of understand that in the master plan, they talk a little bit about a hydrogen economy.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean that Tesla's getting into it. They're looking at the needs worldwide for everything. And they acknowledge the fact that there's going to be some niche applications for hydrogen or some sort of biofuels. So it might be for aircraft, especially long haul aircraft. Short haul aircraft may be able to do it with batteries. They're not saying they're going to be doing it. They're just saying that this is the reality, the economic reality. And with shipping, they might be able to do a lot with batteries. And some cases not. Now, I think there are already some examples in Scandinavia. Lars, I think, would probably know for sure of a few, or it might actually be in Norway, that there are some ferries that are all electric.
Yeah, ferries. I don't think he's talking ferries. I think ferries are easy.
Right. Yeah, those are easy, but just shipping in general.
Cargo ships. Yeah. That's the hard.
Yes.
And
yes. And yeah, that's the hard one, but you will probably start seeing it more and more for recreational boating.
Yes. Already happened.
That's it's happening, but it's going to happen very differently than people think. They think you're just going to take a regular boat hull and throw electric motors on there. It's like, nope. Again, it's a game changer. So when's the last time you were down at the beach or the lake or anything like that, Randy?
Couple of years. Well, yeah.
Okay, but you may have seen it. If you go to some of these places, you'll see these surfers out there that aren't surfing the wave.
Yeah.
Have you seen those?
Yes.
And you know, the surfboard is up above is because underneath it's an electric surfboard. And it allows you to do something that's not possible with a gasoline engine, because you have so much power that you can get down there and you have the battery up there, that you now have the ability to have what is kind of like this winged keel that levitates the entire hull above it. And now your drag profile goes way down. So not only using electricity, but the drag on the boat goes way down on the hull. So you don't need that much electricity. Now, you know what else this does? It doesn't produce waves. Because remember, that's where a lot of the energy loss is going into the waves. Now, what's the biggest bane of boating on the weekend? It's the waves from all the other boaters. That just makes it impossible. And you're trying to crash through it. So now, if you're able to get your hull up above that way, not only do you not care about the waves that you might be encountering, you're not going to be generating them, and they're not going to be generating them. And then it's going to, your lakes are not going to be constantly roiled with all this wavy activity. Boating is going to be a more pleasant experience for everyone. So you're going to be, and it allows you to do that. If you see the way boats went, if you remember back in the 80s, the Miami Vice era, where you had the cigarette boats, and the whole idea was just like this 1,000 or 2,000 horsepower engine or whatever they were putting in there, which was just a big inboard, a lot of noise and whatever with the props that were on there. You don't see that anymore. No one that's a serious boater actually goes with inboards anymore, because it used to be the outboard motors, like, oh, those are the people that weren't serious boaters. The serious boaters, they have outboards, but they don't just have a simple outboard. And now outboards can be like 300, 350 horsepower, maybe even 400. They have not one, not two, not three, but you might see 4, 5, or 6 of these right along the back of the transom. And so you've got boaters out there with over 2,000 horsepower, just an array of these outboard motors. And it gives them a lot of ability. First, it gives them redundancy in their system that, if they lose one or two motors, they don't care. I still got enough to get home. And the other thing is it gives them differential steering and everything else. So they can do some amazing things and keeping that boat controlled and going the way that you want. And the other thing is to get the equivalent amount of thrust with a single motor is that you have to have a prop that gets really, really big. And the bigger the prop is, the more it has to go down, and you have cavitation and all these other issues where it just gets really too big. Now you just have a line of these smaller props and you get this virtual propeller, which is nice and horizontal, which is almost exactly what you want to be able to push the boat forward. And so now you could do the same thing with electric motor. You've seen that with the airplane designs of like, oh, they got a ton of them across there.
Yeah.
Because there's a certain efficiency and elegance to doing that as opposed to having a really big prop. You'd like to have this sort of line that you're pulling it along. So now your boats are just going to have all kinds of new interesting ways of doing propulsion that you couldn't do before. That's going to be a lot lighter. You're going to have the ability for the hulls to come up. Big changes. Doesn't mean Tesla's doing that. They're acknowledging that that's there.
Yeah. Interesting.
They're just acknowledging it, and they're acknowledging the same thing with the VTOLs and everything else. It's there. They're not saying they're going to do it, but they're saying that's going to be part of the disruption. And it's almost like wink, wink, someone do it because there's a disruptive market. And we're not saying we're gonna, but we're saying someone should.
Yeah, and then I think the last one, which I didn't spend a lot of time reading it, that section, but they talked about the switch on the production of concrete and steel, using different methodologies, using different chemistries to eliminate, because I think cement or concrete, I always
a lot of CO2.
Uses a lot of, creates a lot of CO2. It's like maybe the fourth biggest thing on the planet because we create so much of it. And there's been a lot of experimentation with capture. There's been a lot of experimentation with different ways of creating it in the first place so that you didn't have all the CO2. But this master plan was throwing out, I believe, a way of using carbon from hydrogen.
In hydrogen as well. So that was like the reason for the hydrogen.
Right.
Because I think also in steel production, there's a lot of CO2 produced and also concrete. Yes. And so there are some new methods coming up to try to not use that. And it's interesting showing, so there's like the materials required to do all this. And most of them are very standard materials. And then you come across a couple of elements I've never heard of, let alone know how to pronounce. Praseodymium or something like that. And then, terbium and boron. I was kind of surprised that, there's a certain amount of boron needed in wind. I'm not sure what for. And they say exclude or design out. So it's like, yeah, we want to get rid of that. And I'm not sure why we don't like boron, if it's that hard to get. But there's a bunch of other of the rare earths that their feeling is that, oh, you can just design out. They're not really necessary, even though they're sort of used right now.
Right.
For the most part, we're not talking about super exotic things. Was gold being used anywhere? I don't even see, is gold on the list? A little bit of nickel on the list. You don't even see gold on there. You don't see platinum or anything else. So for the most part, it's straightforward stuff that we can mine anywhere.
Yeah, you were looking at the mining requirement. Yeah.
Right. What you would need.
Yep.
Yeah. And then I think it's like almost the last page, just before the conclusion, they talk about recycling.
Oh, okay.
I think it's like page 58.
Oh, here.
And
so
if you look at it.
Okay, here are the materials. Here's the materials page. All right. So there's the materials page. And basically what they're trying to say is in this last section, and I think we can summarize it kind of, the last section is saying there's plenty of all of these materials.
Yes.
Plenty. It's not like the lithium is probably the hardest of all of them. And yet evidently Elon thinks that's solved. Do you remember about aluminum? Yes.
Have you ever been to Paris? And I think there's an obelisk in Paris.
Yes.
And the very top of the obelisk, the peak of that was made out of aluminum, was put on there by, was it Napoleon III or something like that, one of those things. And you know why they put aluminum up there? This is like in the late 1800s.
No, I don't.
Because aluminum was worth way more than gold. It was the most precious element at that time. And it was up there as a sign of like the magnificence of Napoleon III. Now it's like, are you kidding? It's so abundant. Now aluminum is everywhere. Aluminum is in sand, just like lithium. It's like, it's there.
Right.
The problem is we didn't know how to get the aluminum out. It's still very energy intensive, but despite the fact that it's energy intensive, we can produce so much aluminum right now. So most of it comes from bauxite, which is a little bit easier. But if you didn't have availability of bauxite and you need to get aluminum, there are still other ways of getting it because of its abundance. So the problem with lithium right now is it's there. We just don't have an efficient way of being able to extract it that's clean. And that's why they're looking at these other things. And of course, the other irony of the rare earths is they're not so rare either. They're everywhere. It's just that they're so scattered. It's really hard to bundle enough of it up to get a reasonable amount. You just get it, but it's there. It's like you want to get a scoop full of dirt and you're going to find almost all the rare earths in there, but it's just trace amounts. But overall, if you look at how much it makes up the Earth's crust, it's much higher than a lot of other elements, surprisingly. Yeah. It's just finding a nice way. So if you had some sort of like magic, magnet or something like that you just went over your backyard that just was able to collect rare earths, pull it up, you'd probably be fine. You'd probably have all the stuff you need. It's just that we don't have a method of being able to do that.
Yeah. So this chart basically is saying that the most difficult mineral that we need to make all this happen is lithium, followed by nickel, followed by silver. Silver can be replaced with copper. So if you are running a little low silver, you can substitute some copper. Of course, copper has been in short supply for a number of years, but I think that's, again, just a matter, it's always just a matter of, can you get some more mines open and can you get some more refining going? But basically, it's just a statement that it can be done. And yeah, will there be years when lithium is in short supply and they're able to charge the moon because they haven't got enough of it? And will that be followed by the next year where lithium prices are falling off the edge of a cliff because
they're falling precipitously right now.
Way more than 50% from the high. So yes. And that happens with almost all commodities because you have boom bust. Where companies take years to be able to produce. And by the time they get to the production, then the economy has changed on it. Either there's more producers or there's less need. So you can't always predict these things. So anyway, there's plenty of resources available. The cost at 10 trillion is less than it would cost to sustain the petroleum industry. The ability to build the manufacturing facilities, manufacturing plants, to be able to produce the cars, the solar cells, the wind turbines, et cetera, all of the capacity to build those factories is there. It's not something that would be hard to do in this 10-year period. And so I think the ultimate thing is where we started is this is doable in 10 years. It takes leadership. We have the leadership. This guy called Elon Musk. There's some other leaders out there, but it's really Elon Musk. And the question is, will government stand in the way, get in the way?
Right.
Will existing industries attempt to get in the way? Absolutely, they will. Will naysayers get in the way who believe that, gas engines sound cool? We know that all these things are happening, but it looks like it's an immovable force that is going to just be, it's going to be more practical, less expensive. And usually when it's more practical and less expensive, it wins the day.
Right. You can't change the course of a river. You think you can for a while, but eventually it'll overflow its banks and do what it does.
Right.
It's the same thing with market forces and everything else. The FUDIs can do whatever they can to slow it down and make it more disruptive than it needs to be. But for the most part, they're not doing it because they don't believe in it, but because they have a vested interest.
Right.
They're invested in the old technologies and they don't like the fact that they're going to go from being today's winners to tomorrow's losers. So they're doing whatever they can to stop that. But if they were smart, they could look at that and say, hey, we've got a certain amount of capital and everything else, rather than just sitting on it. Maybe if we deploy it, we could also be part of that. So, I mean, that's what I would encourage the people that are trying to slow it down is like, really ask yourself, do you think you're going to stop this train?
Yeah.
Why don't you just get on board?
The Texas model. Sure, you're
Yeah.
a major oil producer, but okay, get some wind going and some solar. Hey, Scott, as always, this has been great. By the way, we love your comments. We'd love to have you comment on any part of what's going on there. I think, Scott, you go sometimes to the comments on my channel as well and see what.
Yeah, I've looked at that, and I've seen some people also add comments to your tweets that were actually quite beneficial. So,
yeah, and of course you should follow Scott on Twitter, because Scott's may not realize it when you look at it, but he's an imp, and he's he's throwing things up on Twitter that are causing a lot of confusion on purpose, and making people laugh. And so you should definitely follow Scott, and I'll put his information. You have a very weird handle.
just going ballistic.
Going ballistic. Yeah. Going
ballistic 5. It's basically, it was kind of I needed a handle and I couldn't come up with one. It was a bit of a joke because I got on the Angry Astronaut Discord channel and I needed to have something. And I wanted something that kind of went along with the idea of an astronaut and also being a little bit upset. And it's like, well, ballistics, going ballistic is basically a ballistic arc. It's like taking a rocket into space, as we talk about going ballistic. And also the other meaning is someone that just rants and gets upset all the time and says, well, okay. I mean, that's it. So I just put that in there and it's like, it's stuck. Couldn't get rid of it. And then someone else had it as a handle somewhere. So it had to be going ballistic 5. That's what it is. Yeah.
All right, Scott, again, thank you for coming on and helping folks to understand more about Master Plan 3, help me to understand more about Master Plan 3. And again, to my listening audience, please like and we'd love to have you subscribe. We'd love to have you hit the notify button, and then do join Patreon. And then, as always, it's been great talking to you.
Okay.